How's he doing? He's doing all right. I mean, you're not good.
Hello, everybody. Hello. So, hi, I'm Mika Lowe. I'm the Director of Women's Studies. So nice to see you all here. Thank you for being here on this rainy day. And I have the distinct honor of introducing our amazing speaker today. Before I do that, a couple of housekeeping tips. We have composting in the back. We would like you to follow the signs and put your plates in one can and put your food in the other can. If you can help us out, we can do more for sustainability on this campus. If you could clean up after yourselves, and if you have to leave early, just do it respectfully. We know some of you have classes at 12:10, so just quietly and respectfully walk out. That would be a huge help. We have a lot of people here today. Any other general announcements that people want to make about things going on this week? Okay, then we'll launch in. So, an announcement.
Yeah, you guys should go buy tickets for this Somehow Play About Sex. Free. Buy it for $0.
So buy tickets for this play, Not About Sex, which is Thursday, Friday, Saturday? Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Thank you. Okay. Friday, Saturday, 7 p.m., Sunday, 2 p.m. Okay, thanks. Any other announcements? Okay. So I want to thank our SIO chair, Kezia Page, for bringing Bree Newsome here today. Wouldn't have been possible without your help. And I want to start with a quote by Ida B. Wells. Do any of you know who Ida B. Wells was? Tell me. I'll tell you.
Like the NAACP, right? But she didn't get credit for it, or like she did like an
anti-lynching campaign. So segregation, way before Rosa Parks. There's much more to the story, but let's just keep it at that for now, and you can take a women's studies course and learn more. So in the 1890s, she was quoted as saying, "I'd rather go down in history as one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it had done a dastardly thing than to save my skin by taking back what I said." So when Bree Newsome scaled the flagpole at the South Carolina State House 3 months ago, 10 days after the murder of 9 individuals at Emmanuel AME Church, and removed the Confederate flag, she took nonviolent direct action to send a message about white supremacy, right? She put her body on the line to confront injustice, and she joined Ida B. Wells, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and countless others in a legacy of activism that we teach about and study here in Women's Studies, a legacy that continues to inspire us today. So, Bree Newsome has been called a modern-day activist superhero by many. In fact, just yesterday, someone referred to her in that way on this campus. So we're thrilled to have her here today. And Bree, we want to say thank you for your bravery, your inspiration, and all that you do to keep the movement alive. And this is, we realize it takes more than one person to make a difference. And so we look forward to learning more about being everyday activists here on campus and beyond. And this is an important moment to stop and pause and say, it's been a year since the sit-in. So we all need to take a moment to think about that, and when your administration to take a moment to think about that, and to honor the movement on this campus that continues, right? So with that, thank you, Bree, for all that you've done, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really awesome. I was just talking with Keys here earlier. I've not been up to Syracuse before, this far up in New York, so it's really awesome. It seems like a really, just from this sampling right here, seems like a really awesome student body. I love talking to students. That's like, so day in and day out, obviously everybody knows me from the Confederate flag action. That's kind of what brought me to prominence, or put me kind of more on a national platform within the movement. But day in and day out, I'm a local organizer in North Carolina. And I'm the Western Field Organizer for Ignite North Carolina, which focuses on student and youth organizing in North Carolina. So a lot of the times I do spend my time like talking to students and youth like 18 to 30. So my first instinct, honestly, I want to get up here to talk with y'all about this sit-in, because I was hearing some about it, and I hope that, I'm going to be here throughout the day, so I hope that maybe later at some point I would really like to talk to you guys more just kind of about like what your experiences are as students and just kind of what you have going on campus, because in my heart and soul I'm an organizer. That's what I love to do. But on the activism front, and specifically, on this issue of the Confederate flag, I'd like to start out by just kind of telling my story about the Confederate flag first, just because I know that, a lot of people have seen the video, but may have some questions about the background, so I just wanted to give you some info on that. And then I would just like to talk a little bit about the modern movement, kind of like where we're at right now, some of the, similarities to the past movement, some of the differences, and kind of where I see us going. So hi, I'm Bree Newsome. It's really interesting. Like I jumped into the movement feet first back in 2013, and I think it's so interesting and ironic that I would, I never would have foreseen in my life having some notoriety around activism or anything like that. I really had not foreseen that being a part of my life. I was always a politically conscious person, a socially conscious person. I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. Anyone familiar with Columbia, Maryland? Okay, cool. More and more. I'm starting to see people kind of know where Columbia is. When I was growing up, nobody knew where Columbia was at all. It's a small, plain community, kind of halfway between DC and Baltimore. And it was really kind of like this liberal community. It was really planned to be, a kind of diverse, progressive environment. And there were a lot of things about it that were diverse and progressive. We had mixed income housing, for instance. The schools that I went to were neighborhood schools, but they were pretty diverse in terms of everything, race, religion, income and everything like that. At the same time, while I was growing up, I still witnessed a lot of inequality. From the time I was like in fourth grade on, my mother actually had to fight to get me into upper level classes because she was an educator there in Howard County in Maryland. And she recognized that from an early stage, what kind of courses you take, especially as a black child, can really impact your whole trajectory throughout grade school and then going forward. And she really had to fight to get me into those classes. And from about fourth grade on, I was often the only black person, sometimes just the only minority, period, in a lot of my classes in grade school. That carried on into college. I went to NYU. I was a film major. For anyone not familiar, filmmaking is a very, very white male-dominated field. It just simply is. I didn't even recognize at the time that I decided to major in film, how much I was really going up against as a black woman trying to break into that field. And so, I say all that to say that it was kind of, in retrospect, looking back on my life, it probably makes a little bit more sense to me now that I am an activist or that I am in this position. But I just certainly didn't label myself that way until about 2 years ago. I was up in New York until about 2012. I was an artist in residence at Saatchi & Saatchi Ad Agency. And then when my term as artist in residence ended, I came back down to North Carolina where my family had relocated after I graduated from high school. I was born in Durham, North Carolina. That's where all my family's originally from, so I have a lot of deep ties to that area. So I just, I went back home, and that was when I plugged in more and started paying more attention to what was going on. And at that time, we had obviously the Trayvon Martin case was going on down in Florida. That had a big impact on me as a person, living in the South. The Trayvon Martin case reminded me a lot of the Emmett Till case. Are we familiar with Emmett Till? Emmett Till was a young black boy back in the 50s. He, came down to the South, to visit people, and he was lynched while he was down there. And there was never any justice brought for his case. And so the Trayvon Martin case, this case where you have a young black boy in Florida just walking home from the store, is suspected or, labeled a suspect simply for walking through this neighborhood, ends up being killed, and then there's absolutely no justice or repercussion for that. Just reminded me, it just felt way too much like 1955. And then at the same time, what was going on in North Carolina where I was, we had an attack on voting rights. So I don't know if folks are familiar with the Moral Monday movement. This was something that was started down in North Carolina by the NAACP, the state NAACP chapter there in North Carolina. So I went out, and again, I was not trying to be an activist. I say this again because one of the questions I get a lot is, well, how do you become an activist? Well, I became an activist simply because somebody invited me out to a rally. I mean, I really, and I try to stress that because I know that somebody said yesterday I was being called super activist, superhero activist, right? But I really like to stress just how human I am and just how, how much my experience can be anyone's experience. It's not this really inaccessible thing to get involved into activism. I was in Raleigh at the time just trying to put a band together. Like I was still completely just on my artist thing, completely cared about what was going on, really supported, the work that people were doing, but just I was not that person that was out in the street marching or anything like that. And so somebody invited me out to a rally, and that was the first time that I saw all these young people who for weeks and weeks and weeks had been going to these Moral Monday protests, where every Monday they would go down to the state capitol. And they would be down there protesting, and because there were a number of things that were going on, not just the attack on voting rights, we had issues going on with our health care, a lot of other things. And so I came out to the protest, and that was the first time I had met like these really awesome young people who had been getting arrested, which to me at that point was like so shocking, like I couldn't picture, putting myself in a place to get arrested. I thought that was just, pretty extraordinary, that there were these young people who were willing to do that. And then that Monday that I went to the protest, I learned about the attack on voting rights that was going on. And then overnight, like between that Monday and that Tuesday, what had happened was the House there in North Carolina had this bill, it's called House Bill 589. And it was like this 5-page long bill that was talking about how students can no longer use their student IDs to vote. That in and of itself was a problem because you're still talking about voter disenfranchisement. They had certain things where they were trying to attack student voters. Again, this is all in response to what happened in North Carolina in 2008, where the state voted Democrat for the first time since like the end of the civil rights movement, the movement of the 60s at least. And then overnight, between that Monday and that Tuesday, the bill went to the Senate, and the Senate added on about like 60 more pages that had all these other provisions that were clearly designed to make it harder for black people to vote, poor people to vote, seniors, and make it harder for seniors to vote. Anyone who, is probably more inclined to vote Democrat, or they might expect to vote Democrat. But even more so than that, it's important to understand that in the South, we're talking about a long history, right, of these kinds of things going on, of trying to keep, especially black people from voting. And these laws that were like rolling back the voting rights came immediately after the Supreme Court had gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which was put in place back in 1965 to prevent this exact thing, because in the South, especially, there were a lot of measures being passed since the time of the Civil War, and I'll get to that a little bit later, to keep black people from voting. So the next day, it wasn't getting a lot of attention at that time. There was a lot of focus on Texas at that time. The Attorney General had said that he was going to go down and, look into the situation in Texas, but North Carolina was getting largely overlooked. So at that time, it was decided that we would do a sit-in in the Capitol and draw attention to the issue. And as I said, I had met all these young people who had already kind of put themselves on the line, had already been getting arrested. And so I just kind of felt in my spirit it was my time to step up. Had no plans, didn't understand organizing, didn't understand what the end goal was. I just understood that I was in a moment where I could make a difference at that time. I didn't have, I wasn't at risk of getting fired from a job. I didn't have anywhere I had to be the next day. So I went in, and that was the first time that I got arrested. And really kind of jumped headfirst into the movement. Again, I didn't come from like an activist background. My parents weren't necessarily activists. I didn't know how you define activism, right? But I just jumped into it. And it's been really interesting being in the movement. So this was before the movement was known as Black Lives Matter, right? You're talking about back in 2013. This was kind of like what I would kind of identify as like the birth of this kind of modern iteration of the movement. Now, obviously, the movement, when we're talking about the struggle, you're talking about something that's hundreds of years old, right? When you're talking about the civil rights movement, you're talking about something that's like 75 years old. So this is not anything new, and I try to make sure that everybody is clear on that I really recognize myself as coming into a movement that has been going on for a long time, and I love that you lifted up Ida B. Wells, that you lifted up all these other women who have been fighting the struggle for a long time, because there have been so many women behind the scenes in this movement for a long time, and they have never gotten the kind of recognition that I got for what I did, but it's important to lift them up. So, I was involved in the movement for about a year. A lot of the actions that we were doing, it was important, really important things. A lot of the things that we did were deliberate kind of nods to the movement of the past. So even like the sit-in that we did, right, in the state capitol is kind of a nod to student sit-ins and things that, had taken place in the past. When I saw change, though, when I saw the change come, was definitely with Ferguson. It was definitely when Ferguson happened, and when we saw that response from the local government there in Ferguson, and even from the federal government, who for a long time ignored what was going on in Ferguson. There were several days where the people of Ferguson were under siege by their local police department. The police department was clearly violating the Constitution, and there was no federal response. And what that sent to, the message that sent home to us, as young activists who have been involved in the movement already for a year at that point, was that, we're not as far removed. We're not as far removed from the past as we, thought perhaps we had been. The sight of tanks rolling down the streets, with their guns aimed at unarmed Black people was probably a shock to a lot of people, but not so much if you're aware of history, because this is not the first time that this has happened, obviously. There's a long history of that kind of response anytime there is like any form of rebellion against the oppressed state. And so when the massacre happened in Charleston, that was really kind of part of what was like the big sparking moment for our choices to do the Confederate flag action. Now, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is just an hour from Columbia. So the Confederate flag has long been a point of contention for us. And I think that's important to understand as well in terms of understanding what happened here. It was not just that because I've seen this reported in some places this way, as though the massacre happened and Dylan Roof was waving a Confederate flag, and then that's when everyone became, aware of the Confederate flag and it became a problem. No. let me just correct the history a little bit. So this particular, well, it's not up there right now, but this particular Confederate flag that was flying over the State House in South Carolina until, a couple months ago, was raised in 1962. This was not a flag from the Confederacy at all. This flag was raised in direct response to the Civil Rights Movement, to the push for integration, to the push for desegregation. The raising of the flag in South Carolina came on the heels of the Friendship 9, which was a group of students from Rock Hill, South Carolina, who did a sit-in. I can't remember the name of the establishment right now, but they did a sit-in at the lunch counter. And what was particularly different about the action that they did was, up until that point, you had people doing sit-ins, they were doing these protests, they were getting arrested, they were going to jail, and then they were having to bail themselves out. Well, the movement was starting to run out of money with this strategy, because they're like, we can't keep coming up with money to bail people out. So they started to peter out, and they weren't quite sure how they were going to keep going. What the Friendship 9 did was they got arrested, and then they refused to pay the bail. And this was kind of, it's not as shocking to us now, but at that time, that was like a real light bulb moment for the movement where folks realized, like, okay, well, what we can do is we can get arrested and we just fill the jails till it's non-operational. And we'll see, like, later, like, in Birmingham, with the Birmingham Children's Movement and things, you see people starting to adopt this method. They just lock it up until the whole system is kind of brought to a halt. And so that Friendship 9, they ended up kind of reinvigorating the movement. And it was in that year, about 1961, 1962, you see these Confederate flags starting to be raised over the capitals in these various southern places. Columbia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. These are also places where you saw in the same time period the states starting to take their flags down. So that's important to understand. Like when we're talking about this decision that we made to go take down this flag in Columbia, yes, the Confederate battle flag has ties to the Civil War, and we'll talk about that as well, which makes it not a bit more palatable to have this Confederate flag flying over the State House. But I think it's just really important to understand that this flag was raised particularly in response to the Civil Rights Movement. It's 100% racist. It's a 100% racist symbol. The other important thing to understand about living in Charlotte, so I don't know if you guys saw, the day that I took the flag down, we had not planned this at all, but there was also a pro-Confederate / Klansmen out of their hood rally that happened later. I mean, that's essentially what it is. It happened later that day. And there's a huge KKK contingent up near where I live. And in fact, a lot of the Klan members who participated in that rally came from North Carolina. So I'm just saying that all so that you can kind of understand a little bit of the cultural context that's going on. I know that for some people, like if you're not necessarily from the South, if you don't see the Confederate flag in your face every day, or if you didn't grow up hearing all that history of it, you might not completely understand the context of it. So when the Charleston massacre happened, that hit me on a deeply personal level. It hit me within the context of this movement, simply because again, having been in this movement since 2013, as I said, a lot of things felt commemorative. But I still have a very clear distinction between the present and the past. Like the 60s were the 60s and now is now, But when the Charleston massacre happened, it felt very much like 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. If you're not familiar with that, that was the incident where, I can't remember the year right now, I'm sorry, 1963? 16th Street Baptist Church was blown up. 4 little girls were killed. If you saw the movie Selma, it's depicted in the opening scenes of Selma. Yes, 1963, yes. So I think that, and I think I speak for a lot of people in the movement, they not expected that level of violence in this day and age, in that kind of way. Even the response that we saw in Ferguson wasn't quite as shocking as the Charleston massacre. And so I know that I felt on a certain level, I was terrified. I was terrified as somebody who's in this movement on a day-to-day basis, working in my community, doing the same things that Reverend Pinckney was doing. I mean, there's nothing that Reverend Pinckney did that warranted his assassination any more than anything that I was doing. I'm out registering people to vote. I'm out pressing my local police to wear body cameras. We had a local high-profile case there in Charlotte recently. Jonathan Farrell, he crashed his car and was in a neighborhood looking for help. Cops showed up, shot him 14 times. So there's nothing different going on at all. And so to really appreciate that in that moment, I was still living in a time where we could be killed. We could be targeted and killed for doing this kind of work. A lot of the meetings that we had locally in my community are at an AME church, Little Rock AME church there in Charlotte, North Carolina. Very similar to Mother Emanuel. These churches are often in our community's hubs. They're places where we have a place to meet. They're places of Black organization. And so it struck a very deeply personal chord for me. But then also, as an organizer in the movement and recognizing kind of like the role of direct action and the different ways that we can use it, one of the reasons, or one of the ways that we use direct action, it can be used to kind of lift morale in the movement. And I recognized at that point, in making my decision to participate in this action, I recognized at that point that there was definitely a dip in the morale at that point. Again, just in the shock of this violence. This was a terrorist attack. This was a terrorist attack aimed at the movement, pretty much. And so I felt that it was really important that in that moment we did something that was bold, that was in the light of day, that showed a clear contrast between our action, which was, light of day, cops in front of us, we're not armed, we're completely, putting ourselves at risk, The contrast between that and a white supremacist walking into a church at night with a gun, killing unarmed people, including, elderly people, children present, and sneaking off in the night, right? So we're trying to make this clear moral contrast for people. And then also just for everyone in the movement, for me, I really wanted to show that we can't let fear have the final say. That, I think it's important to emphasize as well, my family doesn't make it for me to talk on this as much because as much as they support everything I do, as much as they support the cause, it concerns them a little bit. Reverend Pinckney knew my family. We had family connections there because he comes from Richland, South Carolina, where some of my family comes from. And my family has been in the South for like 400 years. My grandmother witnessed the KKK drag her neighbor out his house and beat him because he was a black physician and he had treated a white woman. My great aunt, her uncle was lynched. We don't talk about it. But it's something that we know. And this is kind of like, that's kind of the climate of the South. There are things that we know, but we just don't necessarily talk about it. The fact is that yes, I survived this action, but at the time that I volunteered to do it, I didn't know that I would survive it. And one of the things that I meditated on in making the decision to do it, I thought about figures like John Lewis. I thought about the Freedom Riders. Who have really been an inspiration to me. And are people familiar with the Freedom Riders? Before I go on, okay. So the Freedom Riders, they were a group of young people who wanted to force the issue of integration on interstate bus travel. And so what they did, by the way, against the advice of a lot of the more like establishment civil rights groups at the time who really did not support the Freedom Rides. And I think that's important when I start talking about the modern movement as well and some of the dynamics that we deal with. They really did that against the wishes of a lot of established people within the civil rights movement, including Dr. King, who thought that it was too risky, who thought that it was too agitational, too confrontational. But what they did was it was a mixed group, a racially diverse group. They would get on the buses and they would ride across state lines in violation of the law. And in some places they got stopped by the Klan working in collusion with the police. They were beaten, they were attacked. And I say all that to say that, a lot of times we read history. I'll speak for myself. I read a lot of history about the civil rights movement growing up. And as much as I appreciate it, it never became real to me on the same level that it did when I volunteered to do this action. And I had to really understand on another level what it means to believe in the fight for freedom so much that you're willing to put your life on the line, exactly as you mentioned in that Ida B. Wells quote. I relate to that very much because that's pretty much the decision that I had to make. I didn't know what would happen when I was climbing up the pole. I'm in a completely vulnerable position. If you've seen the video, it's not something that once you're up there, you can't scoot down in like a couple seconds or anything. So I didn't know if there was a risk of a vigilante passing by. I didn't know what the response from the police might be. There was one point where I was on the pole and the police threatened to tase me. At which point I could have been electrocuted. But Jimmy Tyson, he's the guy you see at the bottom of the pole standing there in the construction outfit. He was kind of keeping a watch around me, and he grabbed the pole. He's like, if you tase her, you're going to have to tase me too. And I think that's when the police became aware that there are all these people standing around watching. Some people have cameras, and so they backed off of it. It's just important to understand that yes, I survived. Yes, it's really awesome that I'm down here, speaking with everyone now. But it's 2015, and you can still put your life at risk just for taking down a symbol of hate. A symbol of hate that the legislature at that time had already acknowledged was a symbol of hate. But for me, the ultimate insult with that just came when it was very clear that the state flag of South Carolina was going to fly at half-staff. The United States flag was going to be flying at half-staff, but the Confederate flag would be at full staff as they buried this state legislator who was assassinated. It really was a political assassination as much as it was trying to be downplayed at the time. I think that, sometimes we forget what the climate was like at that particular time, but it was an extremely tense climate. To give you some more context about what was going on, if you're not familiar with the Walter Scott case, the massacre of Charleston comes within the context of the Walter Scott case. Walter Scott was a black man in North Charleston. He was pulled over by a police officer whose name escapes my mind right now. But he was, there just happened to be someone passing by with a camera who caught on their cell phone this officer shooting Walter Scott in the back as Walter Scott was running away, and then trying to plant a taser on his body and argue that Walter Scott had been, wrestling with him. Now, had it not been for this passerby, who did not feel safe enough to go to the police with his video. So that gives you a sense of what the climate is like in Charleston to begin with. That the passerby already knew better than to go to the police. Had it not been for that passerby with the video, we probably would have never known about Walter Scott. Now, Reverend Pinckney, who ended up being killed who was assassinated at Mother Emanuel, he had just been successful in getting body cameras. He got some legislation passed to get body cameras on all the officers in Charleston. So he was a very prominent figure in this Walter Scott case. And that's important to recognize. Like, again, I say, a lot of things we see through the lens of how they were reported at the time, but I'm saying this to you as somebody who has been on the front lines of the movement, that a lot of times things are reported in a way so as not to increase tension that's already there in the climate. So they're not going to tell you things like that it's a terrorist attack. They're not going to use the words like assassination. They're going to try to remove cases from their particular context and make it simply about this one night in Charleston. But it's important to understand all of that to even understand why it was so important for us to do this action with the Confederate flag and why it had the reaction among people in the movement that it did. I want to check on my time because I don't want to talk too much.
You've got time.
Okay. Okay, cool. And I want to make time for questions and everything as well. And so I'll go from there to talking a bit about the modern movement compared to the past. I think that I personally feel like I almost underestimated the reaction that we got from this action. Like I said, I was also operating from a very deeply personal level, as a descendant of slaves, as a descendant of Africans who came through the Charleston slave market, whose ancestors were on a plantation in Rembert, South Carolina for a very long time. It was a very personal thing for me to take down this flag because I'm just tired. I was just personally tired of the level of disrespect that has been shown to my people in the South for many, many years. I was tired of the level of racial terror that surrounds that symbol. I was actually just on a panel at Wake Forest, and this wonderful gentleman, really nice guy, really confused ideas, but a nice guy, this Republican from South Carolina, and we had some great conversation outside of the Confederate flag. But some of the things he said just showed like a complete, he was just completely oblivious to the reality of what it is to be black in the South. I mean, he said to me, well, nobody complained about the flag in 1962. I'm like, well, you have to understand, when I took the flag out in 2015, I was endangered. Like, it was a dangerous thing as a black person to touch that flag in 2015. Nobody in 1960. 1962, we were still just trying to get the right to vote. I think, and I think that's part of what is important as we really look at understanding history and understanding where we are going forward, really understanding the level of terror that has really maintained the status quo, particularly in the South. The racial hierarchy, the racial status quo, the white power structure has been maintained by violence, by either the threat of violence directly from the state in the form of police, or the awareness that a vigilante or the Klan or anyone could take extrajudicial action against you as a black person, and there would probably be no kind of repercussion from the state. You could not rely on state government or anything to get justice in that case. So these are the kinds of things that have maintained the status quo. I think part of why this action got such a big reaction within the movement was that it was direct action, like in the truest sense of the word, right? So, like as I had mentioned to you before, I participated in a sit-in at the Capitol. Now, the sit-in was about voting rights. So we're sitting in Tom Tillis' office. He's now in the House of Representatives. At that time, he was in North Carolina, and we're sitting in his office, and we're refusing to move to the point that we get arrested. Now, we're not protesting the right to sit in his office, right? We're just doing this to draw attention to the issue of voting. What was different about the Confederate flag action was that people have been saying take this flag down for decades. There had been, boycotts to take the flag down. The legislator had talked about taking the flag down. They hadn't taken it down. And this was a group of people who just went together and took the flag down. So it's like in that sense, it's much more akin to Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. You know what I mean? And at the time, I wasn't thinking about it that way. I wasn't trying to be Rosa Parks. I wasn't trying to secure any kind of place in any history book or anything like that. I was just feeling that it was definitely time for people to come together and do this direct action on this matter. I think that what is very different about the types of things that we're fighting today versus the 60s. In the 60s, well, I'll put it this way. In the 60s, we were talking at least about the fight against segregation. That's a much more explicit, overt form of racism, right? You see a colored water fountain, you see a white water fountain, and the issue that you're fighting over is we should just have one water fountain, or we should be able to drink wherever we want to. And so the direct action is easy to choose, and the solution is pretty easy to come up with. Okay, well, we don't have segregated water fountains anymore, fine, okay? But what we're dealing with now is the deeper, more ingrained cultural pieces that go along with it, right? We're really talking now much more about systemic things. We're not talking about just cosmetic things. We're not just talking about when you sit on the bus. We're talking about the criminal justice system. We're talking, right? So it's a much more, I think a lot of times people are looking for things that they can draw direct parallels from the past to the present. Well, who's MLK? Who's today's Rosa Parks? How do you draw a direct parallel here? And in some ways you can draw parallels, but in a lot of ways you can't. And I think it's good that you can. I don't think that we need to the 1960s or the 1960s, the 21st century is the 21st century, right? One of the ways that I see this coming up a lot is the whole issue of who's the leader? Take us to your leader. Who's the leader of this movement? And not understanding that there is a deliberate, it's not just that there's no leaders in the movement, there's a deliberate effort to try to redefine what leadership looks like in this movement for a number of reasons. One, I think it could be argued that having single identifiable leaders made it much easier to dismantle our movement in the past. Look at how many leaders were assassinated, how many of the most prominent leaders were assassinated. And then secondly, it's really important for the longevity of the movement that we are constantly building leaders, that we have new people stepping up to the role of leadership. Because what we're fighting for now, like I said, is not just for us to occupy the same space together. We're already occupying the same spaces together. What we're talking about now is really human rights. We're talking about living in a society that really respects the rights of all human beings. We're talking about cultural changes. We're talking about implicit bias. We're talking about certain assumptions and things that happen on a level that's not even necessarily conscious. And so we are really trying to change the culture. I don't want to talk for too long. I can talk forever and ever and ever. But I don't want to talk for too long because I really kind of am interested in hearing. I know some people have to leave at 12:10. But I would love to hear some questions. Or comments or anything that you'd like to hear more about the movement, about the action, or just some of like what you were dealing with as well.
I have a question in reference to action, leadership, and accountability. Using a signifier like hip-hop culture and being that is the conduit to generating this type of discourse, how is it that, because I am also an educator or an edutainer, just like yourself, just like KRS-One. In reference to using these signifiers like hip-hop culture, as a person of color and an educator, how can I continue to, or how can we continue to make accountability for everyone, because everyone has access to this culture, and being able to create conscious consumers as far as, buying into a Lupe Fiasco or a Kendrick Lamar, people who are actually I'm sorry, people who are actually giving nourishment. How can we continue to generate that? And how can we continue to make people their own leaders to create a stronger union?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I can answer your question just speaking more as a local organizer, like in my community. So like on a local level, what that looks like is really spending a lot of time with young people, trying to build out with young people. So like I said, we are really trying to affect culture at this point. I mean, that's really a large part of what we're talking about. And so in my community, we're kind of focusing on a particular neighborhood right now, which is like West Charlotte, down in North Carolina. We're establishing relationships with the students at West Charlotte High School. So who are already deeply engrossed in the culture, right? So part of what we're trying to do is not necessarily to dictate to them like, hey, this is, you need to be listening to this music, or you need to be more on this conscious tip, but really trying to like engage in a dialogue. Okay, well, why is this, what you choose? Like, why is this catching your ear? Like, let's talk about it. You know what I mean? Instead of me like coming immediately from a point of trying to criticize what's capturing your attention at the moment. Let me talk about why that is. And then like if you're building that relationship with them, kind of like, oh well, let me peek you to a little lengths of views. Let me put you onto some other things, that might get your mind going. Because there's so many brilliant youth out here. They are brilliant. And I think that a lot of times we really shortchange them when we go to them with a set agenda. Obviously there's a lot of things we know. There's a lot of things that I know, obviously having lived a lot longer than a young person does. But there's also a lot of things that a younger person knows that I don't know. And so I always try to approach them from that point of like, dialogue and exchange, and then build from there.
Yeah. I heard a videotape or sound tape of you as you climbed up the pole, and I was struck by. Thank you. I was struck by the mantra or the praying that you were doing as you were ascending and probably going down as well. I wonder if you can talk about your faith and religion and the role that it plays in your activism life or in activism in general, all those movements that you were talking about.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. For me personally, my faith is deeply personal, which is one of the reasons that it's not always the first thing that I talk about, just because it's so intimate. It's a very intimate part of my life. But I absolutely believe in God. I follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, and one of the core, principles of the teachings of Jesus Christ is love. And it's about loving your neighbor as yourself. And just the fact that the love of God is inextricably linked to the love that you demonstrate towards others. And so that in a lot of ways informs my politics in terms of my belief in human rights, in terms of my my commitment to equality. And so I originally had planned to scale the pole in silence. That was my original plan, and then we had decided that if the police, we did this fully expecting that I would be arrested, and that James would most likely be arrested. But we did this with the plan that if I had made it down to the bottom of the pole without the police being there, that I would lay the flag down and just wait for them to come and arrest me, and maybe I would pray or something. But I really planned to do it in silence. But what happened, I had, it was like that, there was the Saturday that we did the action, right? And it was just the Tuesday before that we decided that we were going to do the action. So it was a very short period of time where I really had to really kind of sit with this life-changing decision that I was about to make. And kind of in that time, I went through cycles of like, this is a great thing. Oh my God, what am I doing? Yeah, this is smart. This is really crazy. And kind of in those low moments, I would do a lot of praying and meditating on scripture. And so what ended up happening was, as I was climbing the pole, and the cops showed up, and they were like, come down the pole, man. And I was like, no. This is a bad idea. No, this is down here in nonviolence, sir. The scripture that I had been meditating on was like the first one that came to my mind, like as I was trying to stay focused through all of that. So that was kind of what manifested, yeah.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. This is really lovely and very educational, and just thank you so much. You mentioned the news media coverage of the Charleston massacre, and I mean, that's played a huge role in all of this. And as someone who studies discourse and the media, I was really amazed at how your story was not hijacked. It wasn't, you know, I forget, you mentioned your partner's name, or your
James.
James. You know, it wasn't like, you know, local hero James supports his, you know,
Right.
I didn't feel like your narrative was hijacked.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to sort of what you feel made that possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just reflects the political consciousness of everybody who was a part of this action. I'm hoping to get a link. There's this great video that somebody put together where they have interviews with other people who participated in the action, and I hope you get that out there soon. Because it was not just James and I. There were like 8 to 10 other people who were involved in this action. And as I said, the Tuesday before this action, we all sat in a room and talked through the whole thing, including, you know, what's the reaction going to be? What's going to be, you know, the media reaction? We knew that, you know, whoever climbed the pole, apart from being arrested, was most likely to get inundated with, like, you know, national news attention. Part of the reason why I volunteered for that was because I come from a media background, and so I'm, you know, a bit more comfortable with, like, dealing with, you know, news media and just kind of like what to expect. I already knew some of the BS, you know, that could come. I kind of see like how the story might be spun, you know, in an undesirable way. And so we sat down and we talked about it. That was part of when we decided, well, it should be, you know, a black woman who, you know, climbs the pole. Because a white woman had volunteered as well to climb the pole, but we just were thinking through optics and media and everything like that. We said, you know, a black woman should be the one to climb the pole, and a white man should, you know, stand at the bottom, which would show that this would, you know, reflect everybody who was who participated, because it was black men, white women, all genders, many different faiths, very diverse group. And at that point, it was decided that it was going to be for that reason, to elevate this voice. And so James, from the get-go, was on board with that narrative. And if you've seen him in interviews, he makes it very clear that he was there in a supportive role, you know, as an ally. And he, you know, tries to speak up about, you know, white people needing to step up more, because black people alone can't dismantle white supremacy. So. Sure, yeah, there's a longer statement that I released after the action. It was published on Blue Nation Review. I think if you type in Google like Bree Newsome Blue Nation Review, it will come up right away. I was probably kind of naive. Like, I really thought maybe there was a chance I could take the flag down and not have to speak on it at all. Maybe just kind of go back to just being a local organizer. But when that was obvious that wasn't the case, I decided to go ahead and write out like a full statement that would allow me to say everything that I had to say, because again, coming from media, I knew if I was on that morning Good Morning America show, the first thing would be like, what's your tricks done? How'd you learn how to climb? You know, and I was like, this is really not, you know, I really want this to be more about the issue, you know. So. Anybody else have a question? Oh, yeah.
So you spoke about how there's kind of this gap in the media about relating to
Sort of the context going on in Charleston and across different cities across the United States and across the world, really. A pretty brilliant scholar at Brandeis University, Chad Williams, and a couple other scholars have been working to kind of fill in that gap online. I think there's like a Twitter feed that has like a bunch of different academic kind of resources. Awesome. Speaking to that context, is there anything that you particularly think should be included in any story, any particular case that you think should be included in a resource like that?
To me, it's not so much about the inclusion of a particular case, but it's just kind of how we frame our understanding of current events. You know what I mean? So, like for instance, I was just down in Miami. I was at University of Miami actually, and there was like this really great class where it's a writing class, but they were talking about cultural hegemony. And I think like a lot of times when I look at, you know, we're talking about the struggle that's going on right now, especially for like African Americans. A lot of what we see in reporting, say for instance, is like what happened in Ferguson. A lot of times it is reported, especially in the news, as simply being this case about Darren Wilson killing this one black teenager, Mike Brown. and then everything is reported as though, oh, all of this reaction that you're saying is reaction to Darren Wilson killing Mike Brown. It was never just about Darren Wilson killing Mike Brown. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. Same with Freddie Gray. It's not that there's this one, like everything's fine, everything's peaceful, people got jobs, everybody's happy, I got great schooling, I'm really upward mobile, I'm seeing the American dream before me, and then, Mike Brown got killed and now everything's blowing up. And I think that part, so when I'm talking about the lack of coverage, I would really like to get the resource that you're talking about as well, because I would love to check that out. But yeah, just the way that it's never really framed in its historical context. Like this thing that's going on with police, this is not anything new. It's probably, if anything, I wouldn't be surprised if there's probably less killings going on by police now than at any other point in history. But this is not anything new. And so really understanding, like when we're talking about police brutality, this is not just something that Black people are imagining. This is built into a long, very documented history, especially in the South, of the police and the KKK being one and the same. Like we can't ignore these realities if we're going to be real about trying to build towards the future. And I think we're just kind of at that point now where it's like either we're going to address these things in their proper context, or we're going to continue to talk about minutia. Like did Darren Wilson wrestle Mike Brown, as though that informs the larger situation in Ferguson or St. Louis, which remains like the most segregated city in the United States of America. So, yeah. Somebody back there.
Hi. I just want to say thank you. Oh my goodness. Just from being a 15-year-old child in the South, having that long, ridiculous conversation about the Confederate flag and what it really means, and it's about heritage, and it's about my great-grandpappy, and kind of giving up on it, and just figuring out, they will never understand. And then, just being at Louisiana State University and seeing a purple and gold Confederate flag, and just always seeing that image, and then just like the hurt and disgust of being I was in East Tennessee when all of this happened, when the massacre happened, and just having this conversation with my mom about how, are they really gonna have this funeral with this flag, or is it just that capital, are they serious? So, thank you. I remember that day, I remember that morning, I remember seeing it on CNN, and just from the bottom of my heart, as a little Black child in the South, just thank you for having that courage to finally take it down. Thank you. Thank you so very much. And I wanted to say that when they did have the official removal, again, talking to my mom, I was like, this is wrong. Why are they treating it with such dignity? You did what Bree did. You take it down and, wanted them to stomp on it. But just to say, oh my goodness, you did what so many of us wish that we could have done a long time ago. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. I think a lot of, well, I don't say a lot, but I think there were some people who were kind of shocked. I think there's this perception Mississippi, or Alabama took their flag down, but South Carolina didn't. Not necessarily understanding. South Carolina really has always been kind of the intellectual hub of the Confederacy. I mean, that's really kind of where it started. So it's not again, a lot of things in the present are not at all surprising if you study the past. Ferguson is not surprising if you study the past. It's not surprising that St. Louis would be a place where it would blow up, or Baltimore. It's really not if you really look at the history. And so it's not surprising necessarily that South Carolina was one of the most stubborn in terms of removing the flag. And if you watched, I don't know if you watched any of the debate that was going on their Senate floor as they were, talking about whether or not to take it down. You had some politicians getting up there saying, I'm going to vote to take this down, recognizing that I might not get reelected. I mean, that's how deep. It's very, very, very deep. And I think I say this again because I'm out of the South, and sometimes folks who are not in the South don't understand just how deep the issue really is there.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just thinking,
if you could say just a bit about gender and social movements, because so many of us were inspired by the sit-in last year, which was led by four amazing women on this campus, and the decision for you in your group that it needs to be a black woman to scale the flagpole. Talk to us about how gender plays out in social movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the thing that's important to recognize is that women have always been, and not just women. I mean, all the groups that are like kind of pushing to the forefront now and demanding more recognition of their participation in the movement, queer people, LGBTQ, like the whole movement have always been a part of the movement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Baynard Rustin. If you're not, you should really learn. He had a major role in the movement. But like a lot of other people, because they didn't fit a certain like respectability politic, their names ended up being, kind of buried in history because they weren't elevated so much at the time. And what I think is really amazing about what's going on right now is not only is there a more concerted effort to highlight and acknowledge the roles of non-cis het people and non-cis het males really in the movement. At the same time as that effort's going on, there's also a concerted effort to lift up the names of the people in the past, and I think that's beautiful. Like you see a lot of people walking around with the T-shirts, lifting up names of especially like women in the past who have done a lot of work. You lift up a lot of the names: Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, people who had a major impact, but were not allowed to speak in the past. And so I think it's really great that we are making that more concerted effort now. But I just always try to drive home to everybody that it's not that participation by women in the movement is new. By any stretch of the imagination, women were always behind the scenes making a lot of things happen. They just didn't get credit for it. They just weren't allowed to have the microphone. But they were often, the movement would not have happened had it not been for their participation.
Getting back to the discussion of like double consciousness and institutionalized racism, I'm curious as to how we can go about generating a discourse that doesn't have so much tension involved in it, being that I just graduated from the University of Iowa, where a professor took it upon himself to create a statue of a KKK person and put it in our quad to create discourse. At the same time, as I'm getting my master's, and my research is based around hip hop, which is the representation of the contemporary African American, I'm always very conscious about how I speak and go about creating or generating momentum for discourse, because I don't want to be the black, angry black man. Yeah. How, as a woman, being a person that was raised by a woman from the South in Virginia, understanding that you are the foundation of who we are, how can we go about creating this discourse and really getting to the problem without creating tension?
Yeah. I have personally relieved myself of the burden of educating anyone. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if you're really open to learning about what the reality is for people outside of your personal experience, then I'm more than willing to dialogue with you and talk to you about that. But I think that we have to kind of break away from this feeling that it is the burden of oppressed people to explain the state of their oppression to everyone else. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, well, as much as I support dialogue, and I think dialogue is great, I think it really has to come from an understanding that we are coming together to talk about how we're going to dismantle oppression. We're not coming together for me to prove to you that I'm oppressed. I'm not coming here to prove reality to you. Do you know what I mean? So I think those are two different spirits, and those are the things I try to be aware, kind of be aware of. Like, to me, honestly, erecting a statue to a KKK member as a way of fostering dialogue is not really a way of this is dialogue. Do you know what I mean? And I've been in spaces where, I have no problem talking with people who feel that the Confederate flag is a piece of their heritage or represents heritage, I can absolutely have that conversation with you. I guarantee you it's going to lead back to your miseducation, but we can have a dialogue about it. But yeah, that's kind of my feeling. Like, I think that at some point it's really another form of violence almost to constantly demand that people who are oppressed explain to everyone else the condition of their oppression. You know what I mean? And that goes for anyone. Like, I think it's violent to demand that, gay people explain what it's like to be oppressed. Nobody should have to explain that.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. So I have a question. There's a lot of people in this room that are involved in an activist play this weekend that was written by a student who graduated now, and it's called "This Is Not a Play About Sex," and it's about sex, but it's about so much more. It's about community, it's about love, and it's about deep human connection. And I want to know, like, if you have any advice or as an art activist, what you think we could use, I guess, to put the show on. And I know you mentioned love and a lot of other things, but if there's something that you do before you perform or create your films or anything of that sort.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think art is so powerful and has always been an essential part of movement. Again, like, I said when I started out talking how I didn't identify myself as an activist, but then kind of in retrospect, I look back on it. I think it's kind of hard to separate art and activism, because first of all, there's really no such thing as apolitical art. I mean, like, even when you're going and you're watching Inside Out, was it Inside Out? Yeah, that's not political. There's no such thing as apolitical, because you're talking about emotions. You're talking about the inner feelings of a young girl who's allowed to feel anger. I mean, there's no such thing as apolitical art, first of all. Secondly, when I look back on it, I don't think there's ever been a movement that was sustained without powerful art going on, and I think that that's going to be an essential thing going on in this movement going forward. I really expect that we're going to see a huge explosion in art, music, culture kind of inspired by this movement. And if we don't, I think it's going to be hard for the movement to sustain itself, honestly, because I think an important part of what art does is it kind of interprets life for us in a certain way. Like, kind of there's all this stuff happening, and then art kind of has a way of taking it and kind of channeling it in a way that we can kind of digest what's happening and talk about it. So I don't know if you include, without really knowing a whole lot about what the play is about or anything, I don't know if you include any time at the end for a discussion with the audience. If you're trying to kind of make it, a kind of educational experience or a way to kind of foster dialogue, you do have that? Okay, yeah, then that would be kind of like my main suggestion to you, because as an artist, I don't like to tell people sometimes what my stuff is about. Because I think that, I think there's a few parts to art. There's like the artist, you have your vision, you create the art, but then once you create the art kind of lives in its own space, it becomes its own thing. And it should really kind of be up to the interpretation of the audience. Because I think a lot of times the great thing about art is that the audience kind of brings their own experience and eye to it as well. So I think really kind of opening it up to let the audience kind of comment and share is a really important part of the artistic experience. So, yeah. Sure.
Probably have time for one or two more questions.
Okay, I'm really close to you, so I probably don't need a mic. Can you speak to self-love and self-care, and basically how you use yourself? Because it's no secret that this work is exhausting, and often you can lose parts of yourself if you're not too careful.
I'm so glad you said that, because what's interesting is so I've been speaking. I started speaking back in end of July, I think, was when I kind of started going around speaking, and I promise you the last 5-6 places I've spoken, somebody has asked a question about self-care. And I think that's really interesting, because what I'm seeing happening even locally with all the activists and stuff is people are starting to burn out. People are really starting to burn out. And I think what's really beautiful about activists is I think a lot of activists tend to be very empathic people. You kind of get into the work because you really care about other people and you care about things outside of yourself. The downside of it, and I include myself in this, because I'm really having to learn how to do self-care as well, is that we don't know when to apply that to ourselves or when to take time for ourselves. And I think a lot of times we feel like, you know, if you take a step back from the moment or anytime you give to yourself, it's somehow taking away from what you give to other people. But if we burn ourselves out, we have nothing left to give to the movement. And so I think that one, just from the perspective of, you know, again, the sustainability of the movement and the work, it's important to take care of yourself, but it's also a part of liberation to love yourself and take care of yourself. I mean, part of the whole, you know, apparatus that's in place, this whole like dehumanizing kind of system, the dehumanizing nature of the system, is to convince you not to love yourself. And so it's also an act of radicalism to love yourself and take care of yourself. So absolutely 100%, that's a part of it as well.
Well, I'm right here, so I don't really need a mic, but I'm honestly trying not to fangirl right now. And if you don't follow her on Twitter, change that like now. No, but seriously, like, it was such a big, like, expression of joy. Like, literally, I was screaming in my house at the top of my lungs with my aunt when we saw you take down the flag because of, like, how much it represented for my family. So thank you for that. For a Maryland girl who's just literally just like, thank you. But honestly, like, going back to the social media kind of aspect and how, like, you educate so many people through your Twitter feed and everything, and you're not afraid to challenge people who come on to, who really just try to spread misinformation. It's kind of like, how do you still, like, doing that and also kind of educating also those other people who are minorities who are there and trying to show them that it's unity that it takes to get through this? Because, like, with the media and everything kind of misinforming, it's kind of getting difficult for seeing people kind of join together. It's like, oh, it's a black movement, oh, it's a white movement, oh, it's an Asian movement, when really it's just a movement towards liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that, so I really think of the concept of the collective conscience. Like, I think that's a real thing, you know? There are things that we are aware of as individuals, or things we're aware of in, you know, our different communities, and then there's kind of like our collective, wherever our collective awareness is at. I think that the reality is that this is a global movement. I don't think that everybody recognizes it as such yet. But honestly, like, when I saw what was going on where you had people in Palestine tweeting tips to people in Ferguson about how to deal with tear gas that's coming from, tear gas is manufactured by the same company. The police using the same tactics because they've been trained by the same people. I mean, you're really talking about a global system. And so whether or not everyone who is fighting in their various movements recognizes the, you know, united nature of their struggle or not is a different matter, and that's part of what we're working on as well, and that's on all levels. I mean, even locally, I'm trying to get people in my community, which is, you know, mostly black, to understand that their struggle is connected to the fight for immigration, or any of these, any of these other issues that are going on. I mean, that's part of what we have to do. And through Twitter, just through just being an organizer, I found that social media is a great organizing tool for that reason. And more just for that reason, to kind of raise awareness and educate people. But it's always interesting to me whenever I tweet about another struggle, whether it's the Mexican students who went missing, or again, Palestine, or anything else. I always get like a little blowback from people who feel like I'm taking away from this movement, or from the movement for Black Lives, or all these other things. And I get it because that's where they're at. But I'm just saying, again, as somebody who entered the movement on one issue, I jumped in because I was upset over voting rights. And just over the course of being involved and doing more research and study, I recognize I'm part of a global struggle for human rights that has been going on for a very, very, it all depends on how you define it. I would honestly define it as being nearly ancient. The struggle for things like education, the struggle for access to resources, water, human rights. This is a long struggle. We're talking about it. When we have something like the Confederate flag, we're talking about it within kind of like a racial context. We're talking about, a racist power structure. But we're also talking about a power structure that's only 400 years old. When we're talking about the struggle for human rights, it extends beyond that. That's kind of how I view the work that I do. I view the struggle for Black liberation as being part of the overall struggle for human liberation. There's a saying, don't show up. I'm kind of paraphrasing. Do you know the exact? Because I don't want to misquote it. But it's essentially like, don't show up just to support my movement. Show up because you recognize that my struggle is your struggle. And that's really kind of where we're trying to get the consciousness to be at. I'm not just showing up, to support LGBTQ because I'm an ally and I think it's cool to be an ally. It's like I recognize that we are fighting against the same system, and none of us is going to get free just fighting on our own or just fighting for our own part of it. You know what I mean? So. Cool, is that it? Well, thank you. One more? Okay.
Well, hi, Bree.
Hi.
My name is Bree, and thank you for being here so much. Two things really quickly. If you can make a note about the ways in which I'm an administrator here, and I was a student here and did all the things. And I did all the things, it's great. Anyways, my question being two things. One on rhetoric and the way in which we use rhetoric. And so I think that in terms of social movements and the way that we gather, it is essential in the way that we use rhetoric. And I think I'm really getting hung up on, and this has been a really big thing of mine lately, the way we use the word ally. Right? I have a fundamental disposition to reject all things that say ally. Because I just fundamentally do not believe that you can be a part of a dominant group or narrative and call yourself an ally. It's different to consider yourself an advocate or an accomplice in some ways. But can you remark on the ways in which we use rhetoric in terms of social movements and how that continues to further the understanding of oppressed minority, one. And then two, my second part being, we had a sit-in a year ago. And as an administrator, I'm going to say this in this space and hope that I don't lose my job. It's okay if I do, if I get another one. But anyways, really, my second part being to that is that as an administration, right, far few, if anything, was said, right, was acknowledged, was made 1 year later. That baffles me to this day. Like, here we are a week out from that date, and I am less than a week. And I am fundamentally struggling with the fact that we have returned to business as usual so quickly. And so for the students, right, because as an administrator, we can sit here and claim there are folks in small pockets doing work in small pockets. But for the students, what would you tell them in order so that we do not continue under this mentality as if to say, we had it a year ago and now our work is finished?
Yeah. So, firstly, I see a lot of pushback against the whole concept of allyship. And I think it's healthy. Like, I think it's also probably a sign of progress within the movement that we're having some of these conversations, and yeah, I have a problem with allyship as well because I don't know exactly what that means. Do you know what I mean? To be an ally, again, it kind of sounds more like I'm, maybe supporting your movement because it's politically expedient, but not so much that I really, identify with your struggle. Or really understand how your struggle is like mine. And so we've had a lot of issues with allies, and really kind of pushing back against like liberal racism. Like the way that I would kind of draw the distinction is I like to use affirmative action as an example, right? So I would say like the kind of overt racism is more like, we just don't want you in our institution, period. Or we don't support affirmative action because we believe that it puts you in it puts an unqualified person, in a certain place. Liberal racism is more like we support affirmative action because we don't believe that you can get here on your own, which seems benevolent, but really underneath it is still this sense of there's still a white supremacist kind of ideology, and it's really kind of like this mentality of like, well, it's my job as kind of coming from this position of like white savior to help, those who can't help themselves, who are not capable of really being empowered themselves. And so I think rhetoric really is important, and I think we see a lot of discussion and dialogue going on right now about like really defining what those issues are. Like I said, I have white allies I work with, well, allies, whatever word you want to use, I work with every day. I don't necessarily consider them allies because we don't sit up here and talk about white supremacy even more than I will. They're not necessarily trying to organize black people. They're trying to go out and talk to white people about white supremacy. And I think that is like, if you're really trying to be an ally of like a struggle, I think that's a bit more what it looks like than you trying to organize the people who, are trying to free themselves. And then to your next point about the university, I'm just sitting up here wondering how long they're going to allow me to keep speaking to universities. Eventually they're going to put it together like I'm an organizer and I don't actually just come to speak. And things get active after I leave, and they're going to probably stop inviting me to universities. But I'm glad I could be here with you today. But yeah, I think there's, so like I said, a lot of my day-to-day out work is organizing on campuses like down in North Carolina. And what I see just across the board is like the universities are getting even more oppressive. Like I don't know exactly what the situation is like on your particular campus. Like I said, we can have a private conversation if you want to talk about that, but just things like having access to meeting space, it being very clear that certain groups, if you are more politically inclined, you don't get access to funding or to having the kind of events that you want to have. I see that happening on a lot of campuses. What makes it difficult with campus organizing is, for one, you're kind of only here for like 4 years, most people. So you kind of have to decide how much are you really trying to commit to changing the campus. I have some students, I'm actually going down to App State this weekend, Appalachia State, to talk with them. Those two students, they are students, but they're also really committed to the area. Like they're talking about like long-term, like we really want to change this campus. Like we want to organize, and then after we graduate or get kicked out or whatever happens, we're still here like working with the other students. So that would kind of be like my first question is what are you trying to change, and how much are you really willing to put at stake? And I'm cautious in how I toss that out there because I never tell anybody to do anything that I haven't done myself. I'm not a student organizer. When I look back on it in retrospect, I think there are a lot of things that I could have pushed back and fought for much more at NYU than I did. Like I said, by the time I was a senior film major, I was in class, I was like one of 2 women and the only non-white person. There was probably a lot that we could have pushed back on as women, as minorities, or in any form or fashion. But I recognize that as students, yes, I climbed the pole, I put myself at risk of arrest. But there are also a lot of things that you put on yourself at risk on for when you start really pushing back against an administration as a student. And I think, I just want you to know that I acknowledge that, and I wouldn't, you have to take into account, what possible blowback you might get, what it might mean to your academic career, and decide what are the changes that you're trying to push for on campus, and how much skin are you willing to put in the game. But if if there are people that want to have that conversation, I fly back tomorrow morning, so I'm up here until then. I think we have another event at 4, but like I said, I'm an organizer, so if you guys want to get together and talk some organizational stuff, I am completely available for that.
I want to mention, like Bree said, she's speaking at 4:30 in Love Auditorium if you would like to kind of continue this conversation. Can we have another round of applause? Thank you so much.